Hi there. This talk deals with warfare and expansion in America, both territorial and bureaucratic, mostly bureaucratic. I always start my early American history classes by pointing out to my students that in the 17th and early 18th century, the American mainland colonies were not the center of England's empire. The economic center of the empire were the sugar islands of the West Indies, the Caribbean islands. These island economies financed the vast network of trade routes, trading posts, the naval protection for these trade routes and posts, the naval conquest of new Caribbean territories and more trading posts. And these islands also, the sugar economies also financed the establishment and expansion of American mainland colonies, such as the Carolinas, and boosted the economies of all mainland colonies, from Georgia to Massachusetts. The 13 American colonies, the future United States, were on the periphery of England's empire and on the periphery of its attention. Again, the center, the heart, the important part of the empire were those rich, productive Caribbean islands. And this is evident, the peripheral status of the 13 mainland colonies is evident from England's allocation of military and naval resources to North America. Other than a brief period under Charles II and James II, the English Treasury spent a great deal of money and manpower in defending and expanding its Caribbean holdings and spent very little doing the same in North America. Charles II and James II stepped up the financial and naval and military support or investment in North America in the late 1660s. Following the capture of New York and the signing of the covenant chain with the Iroquois Confederacy, there was a royal attempt to restructure and centralize the northern colonies into this super colony called the Dominion of New England. But all that came to a screeching halt in 1688 with the Glorious Revolution. And from that point on, the mainland colonies returned to their traditional place on the edge of imperial administrators' attention. Okay, so whether you see this as salutary neglect or not, neglect it certainly was. By the Revolutionary era, however, we know that this had changed radically. Britain had, by that point, 10 regiments permanently stationed in these mainland colonies, a number of permanent naval bases on the Great Lakes and on the Atlantic coast, including Halifax and Louisburg, which were two of the most strongly fortified naval bases in the New World. And it had established a permanent military presence in the American West, complete with roads, bridges, and modern forts. Moreover, for the first time since the administrations of Charles II and James II, imperial administrators attempted to use these naval, military, and financial resources to centralize the administration of these colonies, to regulate and govern them more effectively, and to integrate them more fully into the British state, the British imperial state. By the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, and definitely by 1776, these colonies were no longer peripheral to the empire. And the shift was certainly a reflection of the mainland colonies' growing economic and demographic weight, but it was occasioned and aided by a lack of military success on the part of colonial governments. Imperial forces, as well as imperial investment in military infrastructure, were drawn into North America because provincial governments and imperial administrators became more and more frustrated with the military incompetence displayed by colonial military establishments. First in the 1670s, leading up to that, leading to that imperial buildup under Charles II and James II, and then again in King William's War, Queen Anne's War, and in the 1690s to the 17 teens, leading to a creeping enhancement of Britain's direct military involvement in North America by the mid-18th century, in King George's War and then the French and Indian War. The tactical effectiveness of colonial military establishments is a central issue over which military historians of early America argue. The conventional wisdom is that American conditions challenged the accepted and time-tested rules of military science, and that Europe's rules of war, military conventions, did not apply in North America because of the unique conditions there. In the wilderness, the vastness of the theater of operations, Indian tactics, etc. Implicit here is an assumption that regular armies cannot cope with guerrillas unless they adopt some of the enemy's tactics. Okay? So historians such as Douglas Leach, John Furling, Pat Malone, and others have argued that, unlike the British, American settlers did rely on Indian military conventions, as well as common sense, and therefore preferred a more rational, pragmatic, less ritualistic form of warfare, which was more effective. And it was more effective because it was more offensive, with mobile soldiers advancing independently, relying on concealed and accurate fire. Those of you who have seen The Last of the Mohicans may remember that battle scene in which the English were betrayed by their Indian guide and led into an ambush. They tried to get into a tight formation at the beginning of this battle to offer massed and coordinated fire, but the Indians were too quick. They moved around and just picked off the English. And eventually, the Indians were defeated by other Indians and by Daniel Day-Lewis, who was an Indianized Englishman, a settler who had unlearned the European way of war and learned how to fight like an Indian, using individual wit, quickness, and strength, as well as individual marksmanship, instead of relying on a preordained system for the production of massed collective fire. Okay, so it was the skill of the individual guerrilla fighter, not the collective discipline of the group, that saved the day. And this image of British soldiers in America fighting in an outdated fashion, ill-suited for American conditions, has gained even more prominence in American schools and American scholarship since the late 1960s, when images of the Vietnam War once again seemingly proved the superiority of guerrillas over regular troops. The problem is that when you try to trace this doctrinal transformation in colonial military establishments, there's no evidence. In the book I published about this topic, about the English conquest of the American continent and its native population, I argue that the Americanization thesis is misleading in two respects. First, the colonies never rejected European military conventions. They, in fact, embraced these European conventions, and for good reason. And this is point number two. These tactics were not outdated or ineffective, as the 7 Years' War in America, the French and Indian War, clearly demonstrates. Militarily, the colonists remained committed to the accepted principles of European warfare: massed deployment of troops, massed fire, and defensive tactics. Their military manuals, their training, and their actions on the field indicate that settlers did not adopt a new and more offensive philosophy of war. Over time, however, lack of funds and lack of training prevented colonial forces from executing this conventional, conservative European military doctrine effectively in battle situations. This is what explains the failure of the colonies in the late 17th century to replicate the military successes they had enjoyed in the early 17th century. The colonists' military ordeals during the late 17th and early 18th centuries did not lead to a reevaluation and transformation of their military or tactical doctrine. Rather than revitalizing the settlers' military establishments, these episodes highlighted the ongoing degeneration of colonial armed forces. So what was unique in the way the settlers waged war was the degeneration or decline of colonial military forces over time, a decline in professionalism, and consequently, a declining ability to execute European tactics. And this degeneration became patently apparent to imperial administrators, both in the colonies themselves and in the Stuart court in 1676, with a colossal failure of Virginia and the New England colonies to put down Bacon's Rebellion in the south and King Philip's War, an Indian rebellion, in the north. Both conflicts, north and south, began as small, localized, low-level rebellions, but blossomed into horrific bloodbaths. King Philip's War was the bloodiest war in American history. And Bacon's Rebellion was so successful that it led to the toppling of the civil government in Virginia and the establishment of class warfare as a governmental system. The Crown's response to this military weakness was swift. In 1677, 1 year after the restoration of royal authority in Virginia, Charles II, through the agency of Governor Andros of New York, entered into a bond of friendship, alliance, and mutual support and cooperation with the 5 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, which is the most powerful military force in the region, stretching from the Great Lakes to Western Pennsylvania. This alliance is the famous covenant chain, which shaped Anglo-Indian relations for the next generation, and also gave Anglo-French relations in America an increasingly antagonistic vibe. By 1685, when James II came to the throne, after years of personal experience in imperial administration, the covenant chain had contributed to growing tensions and violent clashes between English and French settlers in the Northeast. Having no faith in the ability of colonial governments to deal successfully with military challenges, James II restructured all his northern colonies from New Jersey up to Maine, up to Maine, Massachusetts, uniting them into a super colony called the Dominion of New England, under the governorship of Edmund Andros. And part of this unification involved dissolving the different assemblies of all these different colonies and allowing Andros to govern without a legislature in this super colony. In both these measures, establishing the covenant chain and the Dominion of New England, Andros was entrusted with the responsibility of enhancing England's military potency in North America after the poor showing of colonial military forces in Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia and King Philip's War in New England. And indeed, Andros's first order of business after establishing a new civil and military bureaucracy in this new colony was to raise troops and lead them on an expedition along the northern frontier to quell the violence in New Hampshire and Maine between English settlers and French and Indian raiding parties. And to do so by targeting and intimidating local Indian tribes and their French backers. These sweeping strategic and bureaucratic reforms dramatically enhanced the amount of time, attention, and money dedicated by the English crown to American administration. Now, of course, this imperial reform program ended very quickly as soon as James II was ousted by Parliament in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And the new regime of William III in England, and the incoming king who replaced James II, signaled a return to salutary neglect, to a more hands-off approach, as the governing philosophy in American imperial administration. As soon as the news of the Glorious Revolution in England reached North America, Andros and his staff were arrested and shipped back to England, and all those reforms were reversed. Colonial borders were reestablished, colonial assemblies reassembled, colonial bureaucrats regained their old jobs, and also the reconstructed government of Massachusetts immediately reversed Andros's military policies, reducing the garrisons along that northern frontier and recalling many of the officers. As you can expect, this opened up the frontier and opened up the frontier to enemy raiding parties and exposed English settlements to repeated Indian attacks during King William's War, 1688 to 97. And this free-for-all, these unstoppable or unstopped raids from Canada to and then from the northern frontier into New England led to the near depopulation of Maine. English depopulation of Maine. Since William III left colonial administration in the hands of local authorities, the prosecution of the war was handled in the same clumsy, klutzy manner that had allowed King Philip's War to become such a bloodbath a generation earlier. Okay? And it highlighted the intercolonial lack of cooperation, poor financing, and poor logistical support for provincial troops, and also highlighting the tactical failures of forces in the field. English garrisons and forces in the field were repeatedly caught by surprise, and on the rare occasions in which English forces could locate the enemy, they were often drawn into unproductive pursuits and then ambushed. The governor of Massachusetts, William Phips, sought unsuccessfully to compensate for his colony's weaknesses through military weaknesses, logistical weaknesses, through better logistical and tactical cooperation among neighboring colonies. The problem was that doing so necessitated stepping on influential toes in colonial legislatures in Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, etc., Plymouth. So basically, Phips, the governor of Massachusetts, wanted to establish a regional policy, strategically and logistically. which meant that those other colonies, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, were expected to help fund or even participate in military operations on the northern frontier in Maine and New Hampshire. Joseph Dudley, who was Phips's successor during the next war, Queen Anne's War in 1702 to 1713, followed up on this effort. Like Phipps, Dudley repeatedly clashed with neighboring governors over their wartime responsibilities towards Massachusetts and New Hampshire. Unlike Phipps, though, Dudley was more successful in bullying his neighbors into supporting his war initiatives because he used London and Whitehall connections to involve British administrators in strategic and logistical planning. Okay? So instead of begging neighboring governors and legislators for help, Dudley arranged for the Queen to order neighboring colonies to contribute funds or supplies or men to Dudley's operations in the northern frontier. The orders regarding the purchase of firearms, ammunition, and other provisions, and regarding the establishment of supply depots were issued in London, not Boston. The Queen's agents also mobilized the diplomatic and military support of allied native tribes like the Iroquois, and the Queen herself pledged naval squadrons and regiments of British regulars to take the lead in Dudley's offensive plans against the French in Canada. The point is that Dudley had to contend with the traditional problems faced by colonial commanders: the amateurism and inexperience of the officers and the men, poor training, small military establishments, limited resources, and a tradition of intercolonial discord. By successfully petitioning the Queen for joint Anglo-American operations, Dudley managed not only to significantly increase the funds and number of men at his disposal, but also to gain access to a source of experienced, disciplined, and dependable soldiers, meaning British soldiers and sailors. And with Britain's support, Dudley's government became successful in creating a degree of regional coherence on a strategic and logistical level. So it was through a closer cooperation with London and with aggressive support from the British Navy and Army that the New England colonies were finally in a position to bring their logistical advantages to bear against their rivals, unlike the situation in King Philip's War and King William's War. And in this respect, Queen Anne's War signified an important transition in the Northern colonies' military history. The poor performance of colonial forces in King Philip's War and King William's War led 18th century colonial magistrates, like Dudley, to address the shortcomings of their military forces through a greater reliance on British forces, the British Treasury, and British imperial administrators. In the next large-scale military contests, which was King George's War and the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, the guiding hand of British officials would be even more pronounced. So the degree of British logistical, strategic, and tactical involvement in North America increased from war to war in the 18th century, culminating with the 7 Years' War, in which British forces performed the bulk of the fighting. This transmission of European military culture to the periphery of the empire was a typical characteristic of a transatlantic English civilization. When examined within the context of imperial history, the story of warfare, like the story of politics and culture in colonial America, reads as a process by which the colonies gravitated towards England's cultural and administrative and military sphere of influence, rather than drifting from it or trying to liberate themselves from it. But the same is true in the other direction. The British government was drawn into colonial administration to a much greater degree than even before, than ever before, by this process of military spending and planning and command and combat. All this money, all this manpower deployed in North America, all the money spent and all the manpower deployed and all the infrastructure deployed in North America, all of it came with strings attached. The British Treasury and its financial backers and creditors and British taxpayers invested more and more money from one war to the next in the 18th century on military defense and territorial expansion in America. During the 7 Years' War, for example, Britain's national debt nearly doubled from 74 million to 132 million pounds. This level of investment prevented Britain from continuing the laissez-faire approach to American administration that had characterized salutary neglect in the previous century and a half, or century and a bit. To protect its investment, and maybe also to recoup its losses and pay the debts incurred by creating this massive British presence in America, the British Treasury invested in permanent bases, garrisons, ports, roads, bridges, supply depots, supply transports, etc., as well as commissioners to manage all of these assets. Not to mention the customs officers and court officials to collect the taxes and adjudicate smuggling cases. North America was no longer a sideshow in the empire. At that point, by the 7 Years' War, and certainly after the 7 Years' War, North America represented a major investment and a major debt. And so the Treasury initiated policies to ensure efficient and centralized management of these territories and assets. Policies to improve law enforcement, combat smuggling, streamline colonial bureaucracies, reduce wasteful spending, curb colonial profiteering, and create revenues for the British government. When James II and Edmund Andros had done this back in the 1680s, it sparked colonial resentment and resistance and led, with the removal of James II and Andros, to the reestablishment of salutary neglect as the imperial policy, reestablishing the local governments as the dominant force in America. When George III did the same thing in the 1760s and 70s, it sparked similar resistance aimed at similar ends in the American Revolution. Thank you.